The unsurpassed, penetrating, and perfect truth is seldom met with, even in 100,000 myriad kalpas. Now we can see and hear it. We can remember and accept it. I vow to make the Buddha's truth one with myself. Homage to the Buddha, homage to the Dharma, homage to the Sangha. Well, I'll apologize in advance for my usual chaotic and disorganized mind. I'm just getting back from Germany, and I mentioned that I'd been asked to give this talk today, and I didn't know what I was going to talk about it, so one of my lay disciples suggested that I talk about training for the long run. And the long run in Buddhism is a very long run. I mean, very long run. When I first started reading about Buddhism, they mentioned the word chiliocosm, and I had no idea what that was. But it turns out it's universes upon universes. Just infinite universes. But yet the universe itself is only a small part of this. So the Buddhist picture of a long run is very big. Catherine, would you like one of those hearing devices? Because and the eighth vow of Samantabhadra is to always follow the Buddha's teachings. Always is the long run. That means that when we commit ourselves to keeping the precepts and to doing our meditation, hopefully every day, we are committing ourselves to become Buddhas. And the scripture of great wisdom talks about going on, always becoming Buddhas. It's very helpful to see ourselves and everything else in the universe as impermanent. And that's how Buddhism understands emptiness, because there's no thing that is the self that goes from life to life. The time of the Buddha's death, he had his enlightenment, he had the knowledge of 500 and some past lives. And there's no start to this and there's no end to this. The long run is committing ourselves to doing all that's necessary to realize our Buddhahood. And it's like meditation. You're noticing when you're meditating when you notice that you're not meditating. So every time you see the mind is wandering, every time you see yourself caught up in some music or other distraction in your mind, and you wake up and you return again to that stillness, that's what the meditation process is about, is seeing where we're not meditating. Well, training is the same way. It's noticing when we're breaking the precepts, noticing when pride arises, or fear, or anger, judgments, noticing all of those things and letting them go. And this commitment to keeping the precepts can give us a spiritual purpose for our lives. Because when Buddhism first started, his first disciples wanted to clean up all their karma so they didn't get reborn. And later in the Mahayana tradition, it's realizing there's no self going to get reborn anyway, so you might as well commit yourself to working endlessly for all living things. Because we are connected. And I'm going to talk about this drop of dew in a few minutes and our connection with the great ocean. The confession verse is really essential here to understanding what we're doing in the long run. May all the Buddhas and the ancestors who have become enlightened have compassion upon us. Free us from the obstacle of suffering which we have inherited from our past existence, and lead us in such a way that we may share in the merit that fills the universe. For they in the past were as we are now, and we will be as they in the future. All the evil committed by me is caused by beginningless greed, anger, and delusion. All the evil is committed by our body, speech, and mind. I now confess everything wholeheartedly. Well, that confession verse is pointing us in the direction of becoming Buddhas and ancestors. And it requires us to look at all the places where we're not keeping the precepts. It requires to look at our greeds and angers and fears. But we have to look with compassion. If we look with judgment, we just get discouraged and into despair. Because doing the best we can requires that we have to see that there's a next step. I may have done the very best I knew yesterday, but I might have seen that there was a little bit more I could do. And that little bit more is always taking that next step into the unknown. When I first heard Reverend Master Jiu talk, she gave this image of this SS officer in World War II whose job it was to mete out punishment for those convicted of espionage. And his camp was on the southern border of Germany next to Switzerland. And he had two doors behind his desk. They were both painted black. And he said, you get your choice. You can get the firing squad here, but I can't tell you what this one is, but you get your choice. And she said, this is Buddhist practice. It's the door to the unknown. And all of our suffering is created by ignorance. There's something we don't know. And that lack of knowledge creates suffering. And ignorance is the source of that suffering. There's something we're ignoring. There's something we don't know, and we haven't recognized our ignorance. We have to look more deeply at what it is that's going on and seeing that we are creating the suffering because there's something we don't know. And that something has to do with, learning that something has to do with this door to the unknown. The people were given that choice. This choice, he had a car running with the engine running to take anybody across the Swiss border who had the courage to take it. Very few did. Because of the judgment, you've already been convicted of espionage. There's a judgment there. That's the judgment is the thing that is the conclusion. It's the end of the road. There's nothing more to learn here. I'm a bad person. That's all there is to it. Or I'm a good person, and everybody else should be bowing at my feet. Those judgments are the things that contain our ignorance. Because we're clinging to that ignorance, we can't understand what it is that we need to do. Thich Nhat Hanh takes the Chinese character for ignorance, for patience, and it shows the ship and three drums at the bottom. There's a stained glass window up here behind the altar with this picture of the ship with the three little circles above it. And so the character for patience in Chinese is the ship and three drums, and above that is a sharp knife. And the ship and three drums represents the heart-mind. People think that your brain is the source of your consciousness, but it's actually the heart. And this heart, you have to make your heart open wide enough to hold those spiritually difficult things so nobody gets hurt. And that opening up is this letting go of our ignorance, to seeing in our training where our ignorance has caused suffering. And our reaction to the circumstances creates these emotional reactions, which is a source of that suffering. And I'm oversimplifying this a bit. But there's a difference between responsibility, responding, and reacting. And that emotional reactions are conditioned from our old karma. And we have our job in converting that karma is to allow those reactions to arise and let them pass through. I was on my trip to Germany. I asked the airline person, from Iceland, what's the time difference from where we left in Iceland to when we got to Berlin? And he said it was 1 hour. So I set my watch to the 1 hour difference, and it turns out that there was actually 2 hours difference. So I missed the plane from Germany to Switzerland, and I was in a state of panic. And realizing what the panic was about was that I couldn't figure out, first of all, why I missed the plane and why it could have gone already when I watched it. I had an hour left. And so the person at the airline desk told me I could get on the next flight, which wasn't, however, until the next morning, and that there was a hotel down the street. Which turned out to be a very nice thing, actually. I felt in my messed up, jet-lagged, confused mind state, walked into this pristine, German, clean hotel. I was thinking, I've messed this place up just by walking into it. Do I dare take a shower in this glass shower that didn't have one water spot on it? But I did, and I enjoyed it. And they had good food, and I sat outside on a lovely spring evening to eat my meal, and I thought, oh, this is a much saner way of traveling than catching that last plane trip. But the external circumstances to which we react, they're not the source of our suffering. They're just the circumstances, and our reaction to those circumstances is what we experience as suffering. And our willingness to take those circumstances and learn to respond from our meditation, to really listen to your heart. The whole purpose of meditation is to get you quiet enough to actually listen to something other than the babble of the mind. But we're in this for the long run. And that may take 3 plane trips in one day, or it may be infinite lifetimes, depending upon how you're looking at this space of time and space. And it's the commitment to the process of training that allows you to find that place inside that is undisturbed, even in the midst of a strong emotional reaction. Dogen has this image of this dewdrop that's hanging from a blade of grass in the evening. In that dewdrop is reflected the full moon, and the entire night sky in one drop of water reflects this entire universe. Well, let's take that drop of water for a long run here. It falls into a creek that turns into a river, that turns into a lake, that generates electricity at the end of that lake. It's a man-made lake. And so it turns the water into electricity and into heating and cooling our homes, to doing all the things, all the electrical things that need doing. And that water continues down into the ocean. There's a lovely image of River Master Moke again painted of this great ocean, which is this ocean of lotus blossoms that River Master talked about in her experience on how to grow a lotus blossom. Each of the lotus blossoms in River Master Mokuzen's painting has a little jewel in it. And when I looked at that painting, I thought, oh, that's a person inside that lotus blossom. But it turns out that she meant it to be a jewel. But it's no different, actually. Each of those lotus blossoms has a jewel in it. And that ocean, the water gets into the ocean, and where is that drop of water when it gets to the ocean? What happens to a drop of water? Well, this is what happens to us at the time of death. The drop of water falls into the great ocean. There's no longer a barrier between us and the ocean. And we are all already in this great ocean. The Buddha mind was defined in a poem by Reverend Master Chushin before he died, which is that which fills and contains all things. So the Buddha mind is this that has no barriers. The great ocean is the Buddha mind that fills and contains all things, and we are just one little drop of dew that's fallen into that great ocean. So where is the self there? Where is the self that's going to do this training in the long run? Who is this being that's going to be running around here for a long time? I think it helps us most, one of the things that helps us is to see that we are not nouns, we're verbs. There's a book I read about a woman who's a native person who's got a PhD in biology, but she also has this Indian's respect for the land and the earth. And they start with a whole different description of how the earth was formed. In her tribe, this sky woman falls from the universe into the earth, and she's holding a bunch of seeds and plants in her hand, and he ends up on this whole ocean, great ocean, and there wasn't any place to plant these seeds, and all the little creatures were trying to dive down and find some sort of earth at the bottom of this ocean, and the muskrat makes it. He comes back with a little fistful of dirt, puts it on top of a turtle's back, and that turns into then continents, and eventually. But there's no concept of being kicked out of the Garden of Eden in Judeo-Christian and Muslim traditions, God-based traditions. And so there you don't start with a concept of fundamental badness, as Reverend Master Koten calls it. And so there isn't that sense of letting go of that badness. She talks also about cultures that are based on generosity have this feeling that there's always a sufficiency. Cultures that are based on money and material wealth, there's never enough. And it's a very interesting way of looking at that and where that's coming from. But this long run develops out of going beyond the inadequacy and the fears and the greeds and the angers. And it's seeing, however, all the places where we act out of these conditioned reactions. And in order to do that, you have to look at these things in a different way. I heard this beautiful song sung by a father and his 12-year-old son, one of the talent contests, and they wrote a song about "We Are the Lucky Ones" because some of their relatives and friends had died at an early age, and I thought that's actually a very good Buddhist song. We are the lucky ones. We have been drawn to this practice, which is capable of showing you how to take suffering and turn it into wisdom and compassion. But each of us has to do that for ourselves. The Buddha was not a savior. He couldn't do this for everybody, but he could show everybody how they can do it for themselves, because essentially we all have just as much of the Buddha nature as we need to convert that old ignorance. But we have to accept the responsibility for our old karma, for our emotionality, for our fears, our greeds, our angers. We've just inherited those, but there's no me there to inherit them. I'm just stuck with this stuff. And so this is what we have to deal with. And everybody has the suffering, and without the suffering you wouldn't make the effort. I was listening to a Dharma talk by a Buddhist, Tibetan Buddhist who spent 20 years in a Chinese prison. He did everything they asked. They were so delighted by his willingness to do whatever was asked that they were going to shorten his sentence if only he would speak against other people and tell them how they didn't like the Chinese. Well, he wouldn't do that. And that willingness to do whatever is asked, that willingness to keep the precepts, to not talk about, speak against others, this is what allows us to take that next step into becoming a Buddha. But we have to commit ourselves to this daily practice of sitting still. We have to commit ourselves to looking at all the places where we're not keeping the precepts, all the places where we're not meditating when we meditate, all the places where we made mistakes. But we have to be able to see those through this eye of compassion and not judgment. And we have to see all the places where we are judging. And we have to laugh at the stupidity and silliness of the self. It is an illusion. It doesn't exist, and we take it very seriously. And the less seriously we take it, the happier we are. But suffering is a fundamental fact of human existence. If we didn't have it, we would be like in heaven, and that's where Master Jisho talked about heaven being the most dangerous of places because it's too easy. Dogen has a chapter about the value of taking refuge in the three treasures. And King Sakrenda is the king of heaven, and people in heaven live for 30,000 years, and they usually die and get reborn right away in heaven. But you get an image of where you're going to get reborn if you're in heaven. And King Sakrenda saw he was going to get reborn as a donkey. Well, he didn't want to get reborn as a donkey, and he rushes to the feet of the Buddha and is taking refuges. There are three refuges in Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha, and he dies. But he was a little slow on the uptake. So he ends up being reborn in the womb of a donkey. And the donkey is parked out in front of a pottery merchant's stall and has a metal bit in her mouth. And she shakes her head, the bit flies out of her mouth and busts some pots, and the pottery merchant gets most upset. He comes over and he beats the donkey. And the donkey miscarried. So Sakrenda gets reborn into heaven. And Dogen doesn't go into what the karma between the pottery merchant and the donkey. That's another story altogether. We can identify with the pottery merchant and the donkey ourselves from time to time. But the value of taking the refuge kept King Sakrenda from getting reborn as a donkey. But the sooner we do this, the better. The sooner we take refuge in the Buddha and the Dharma and the Sangha and commit ourselves to that process, the fewer lives as donkeys we have. Although donkeys have the Buddha nature as well. And some of the past lives of the Buddha has to do with with him being born as animals and doing noble things as animals. I had a friend who was having a very difficult time with this mass in her chest and was not able to function and ended up not being able to get out of her hot tub where she went to relax. The dog recognized there was something wrong, and he runs next door to where her daughter lives and runs around the house until the daughter lets him in, and then he runs around the house until she finally lets him out, and she follows him over to her mother's house. And she was able to call 911. And this is a bodhisattva dog who recognized there was a need here and responded in a very wise way. And the more we respect other beings, whether that's the ants that are invading our house or the fleas that you have to get vaccine for in Germany, or the animals that cause us trouble sometimes. Everything in the universe is a manifestation of the Buddha nature, but we don't always see that because we're looking through this filter of self. And we have to start recognizing how it is that we create suffering by twisting our perception through this filter of self. And I refer to training as doing this kind of fine-tuning adjustment. We have to, like on a radio, if it's all this static, we have to tune it in to the right channel until we get a clear reception there. And all of our suffering is like that, static, that we create for ourselves because we haven't done this fine-tuning adjustment to be able to see things as they are and not as we perceive them or see them. And making this adjustment to how we look at things from the point of view of lacking something and thinking, I want to get something out of my training, to see that the training is there to show me how to give our attention to our training, how to share our understanding, how to open the heart to hold those difficult things, how to see what it is that give myself to the ignorance to see what I have to learn. It's a process of being generous with ourselves, being generous with other people, opening the heart to the door to the unknown, not knowing where that's going. To see that it is our job to open up rather than to hold on. A society based on money is a society that thinks that they can find peace of mind if they have enough money, and then they get all these beautiful possessions, and then they get worried about somebody stealing them or somebody messing them up, or their $10 million painting gets messed on or something. Those worries are created from not being able to be generous with our stuff, whatever that stuff is. Our mind, our hearts, our bodies, our possessions, our whatever. And that generosity is one of the paramitas that leads us across to the other shore. And so we got to see all the places where we're not being generous. Just like our meditation, just like our practice. And again, see them with that open heart. To see that we can take those things that are suffering and do this fine-tuning adjustment to see what do I have to do to learn from the situation. And that's what it does. It means to be responsible. I take responsibility for whatever the old karma is that causes me to experience greed or anger or fear. And then I look at that and see, what can I do with that? How can I benefit from this greed or fear or whatever it is? And what do I have to give to that ignorance? And that giving is how the heart opens. So I've babbled on in my confused and ignorant fashion long enough. Thank you for coming.